Track isn't just a career, it's my lifeblood. Every drop of sweat built this legacy. Without these lanes, I am nobody. He conquered the world, leaving nothing for anyone else. Yet, one rival never earned his true nod. Michael Johnson didn't just win. He colonized. His movement was surgical. A cold, mechanical masterclass in lethal efficiency and absolute self-control. To outsiders, he was the flawless face of Olympic glory, pure gold, zero scandals. But that's just the surface. Johnson saw himself as a breed apart from the pack. Faster, sure, but in his mind he was purer, harder, and far more lethal. That conviction drew a jagged line between him and those who failed his test. One name lived on the dark side of that divide, a ghost he couldn't shake. It wasn't about one finish line, it was the cloud hanging over every stride, the backroom talk and shifting shadows of a legacy Johnson simply couldn't swallow. Speed was secondary. This was a war over the very soul of the sport. Who truly deserves the title of great? First, let's dissect the man known as Michael Johnson. Dallas, 1967. The legend's blueprint begins. No slums, no silver screen struggle. His start was as orderly as his finish lines. He was forged in structure, where high demands met zero tolerance for weak excuses. That rigid iron framework would define every single step of his storied professional career. Under Clyde Hart at Baylor, Johnson wasn't merely coached, he was meticulously engineered. While others ran on raw fury, Johnson engineered an unorthodox style that looked completely alien. Back straight, feet hammering like pistons. It wasn't pretty, but it was absolutely devastating. It was clinical, repetitive, and terrifyingly effective. That was the whole point. By the early 90s, he was already the most feared quarter-miler on the planet. Barcelona 1992 gave him relay gold. Yet he remained a ghost among stars. He sought mastery, not fame. Then came Atlanta 1996, total, unadulterated dominance. Johnson didn't just beat the field. He shattered the very concept of the race. In that 200-meter final, he vanished, leaving the world record in his dust. Days later, the 400 fell, a historic double that left the history books reeling. Those golden spikes were flash, but the man inside them was pure, hard steel. Calculated, confident, authoritative. By Sydney 2000, his era was undisputed. Another gold merely cemented the inevitable. He wasn't racing men anymore. He was chasing the ghost of a perfect human. This is where the friction begins. When your identity is built on iron discipline, you don't just judge times on a clock. You judge souls. He divided the world into those who earned it and those who didn't. Starting with, he was the heiress gold standard. That's why Butch Reynolds stuck in his throat. Number 5. In the early 90s, the 400 meters wasn't his kingdom. Not yet. It belonged to Butch Reynolds, a quiet machine whose world record reset the entire bar. Reynolds was low-key, but the storm surrounding him would forever change Johnson's worldview. 1990, Reynolds tests positive. The sport's heart skips a beat. A ban followed instantly. For most, that would be the final, shameful chapter. But Reynolds didn't go quietly. He declared war on the very system that judged him. He sued the suits, claiming the labs lied. Shockingly, he won his way back onto the track. It looked like redemption on paper, but reality was far more jagged and complicated. To a man like Johnson, a legal clearing did mean you were actually clean. It was about trust, about standing by a system that was already on the brink. Back then, Johnson was just a kid finding his footing, forging the ironclad identity the world would soon fear. He didn't see a fair fight, he saw a mess of shadows and doubt. Reynolds fought his way back, but the stain stuck. Most athletes looked the other way. They just moved on. Not Johnson. He didn't play the media game or throw punches in the press. He sent a message through sheer silence. In his world, there was no room for maybe. You were either clean or you were a fraud. Period. As Johnson climbed the ladder, his dominance became absolute. By Atlanta 1996, he wasn't the hunter. He was the prize. He was the gold standard. Yet, the ghosts of the early 90s still lingered. Reynolds was the embodiment of everything Johnson could stomach. This wasn't about a lane. It was about the soul of the race. Johnson built his legend on one rule: never leave a doubt. Years later, Johnson would choose his words on doping with surgical precision. He never named names, but the steel in his voice said it all. The sport had to be pure. The bar was absolute. No excuses. That fire didn't just start on its own. It was forged watching the Reynolds scandal, seeing how fast a sure thing could turn into a lie. He decided then and there to cut himself off from that toxic world for good. It wasn't hate, not the way people usually think of it. There were no shouting matches, just a cold, permanent distance, a line drawn in stone. Reynolds stood on one side, Johnson stayed on the other, and he never looked back. Number 4, Donovan Bailey. As Atlanta 1996 approached, Michael Johnson was ready to set the world on fire. But a few lanes over, a very different storm was brewing. Donovan Bailey had just seized the crown, crushing the 100 meters to become the fastest man alive. To the world, that title was gospel. The fastest man on earth wasn't up for debate. It was settled in 10 seconds, but Johnson wasn't buying it. In his mind, speed wasn't a sprint. It was a kingdom. True speed was about owning the track across every distance. In Atlanta, Johnson did the impossible. He swept the 200 and 400, shattering the world record so badly he didn't just win. He vaporized the field. That wasn't a race, it was an execution. That is when the friction started. The press began hunting for an answer to a question neither man had asked. Who was the real king of speed? Bailey had the belt, but Johnson had the sheer, terrifying power. The noise only got louder. The talk got uglier. The knives came out in every interview. Johnson claimed the 200 was the ultimate test of gas and guts, making him the superior animal. Bailey didn't flinch. The 100 meters was the only truth that mattered. What started as a locker room argument was about to turn into a full-blown war. In 1997, they set the stage, a 150-meter death match. The final answer, a chance to bury the beef forever, but the showdown the world wanted. It never truly happened. Halfway through, Johnson's body betrayed him. He pulled up lame, and the fallout was savage. Bailey crossed that line solo to the fans. It was the final nail in the coffin. Bailey had his proof, but to Johnson, that race was a circus act, not a contest. He'd stepped into a distance that wasn't his, under bright lights that felt more like a Hollywood show than a track meet. When that muscle popped, it gave Bailey a gift Johnson refused to call a victory. It wasn't a win, it was a narrative, a ghost story that would haunt them both for decades. Bailey leaned into it, strutting with the confidence of a man who knew he'd won the room. Johnson never blinked, not then, not years later. Never. This was track and field anymore. This was a battle for history. It was about who gets to define greatness. Bailey stood for the lightning strike, the one moment that changes everything. Johnson was a different animal entirely. Pure precision, long-term dominance. That rift never healed. No final battle settled it. Just two icons yielding zero ground. That reality likely haunted Johnson more than anything. Bailey's existence wasn't the issue. His narrative was. Number 3. Maurice Greene. By the late 1990s, sprinting's center had shifted. A new king emerged. Maurice Greene didn't just win, he conquered. Everyone knew his name. Confidence wasn't a choice, it was his projected aura. That swagger clashed with Michael Johnson's stoic discipline. No theatrics, no playing the crowd. Johnson's races were silent executions. Calculated and cold, Greene turned every finish into a loud manifesto. Chest out, shouting. He wasn't just winning, he was stealing the show. Initially, they moved in separate orbits. Different races, different fans, but track demands comparison. Greene made that collision inevitable. He dubbed himself the world's fastest man, repeatedly, loudly and without apology. To Greene, the 100 meters was everything. By ruling that dash, he claimed the sport's hierarchy's peak. Johnson never bit. He refused to engage Greene directly. He stayed distant, but his silence was surrender. For Johnson, greatness meant versatility across various distances. Controlling multiple pressures made Greene's single event claim feel hollow. Their friction wasn't a brawl. It was a war of philosophies. Greene led a loud era where personality fueled the performance. Johnson was the old guard. Disciplined, internal, and focused, execution trumped optics. That tension burned without a single race. After Greene swept Sydney 2000, the hype turned nuclear. He was the new face of speed, the undisputed standard. Johnson still ruled the 400, but the spotlight shifted. The definition of a legend was changing. A hard truth for Johnson. It wasn't Greene's talent, it was the flashy ideology he represented. Fame in one dash should outweigh total athletic mastery. No public drama occurred, yet the chasm widened. Johnson never respected Greene's version of glory, and Greene never needed the veterans' approval. Two titans, zero common ground. Number 2. Bolden. At Atlanta 1996, Bolden arrived as the rising star. Trinidad and Tobago had never seen a powerhouse like him. Bolden didn't hide his hunger for the crown. He believed he belonged in Michael Johnson's elite circle. Johnson disagreed. He arrived with the eyes of an assassin. He wasn't seeking peers, he was there to dominate. By the 200 meters final, the gulf was undeniable. Bolden was a challenger, Johnson was a force of nature. At the gun, the outcome felt like a predetermined fate. Johnson did to just win. He vanished into the distance. Rounding the final turn, it wasn't even a contest anymore. This wasn't a race. It was a demolition, a fresh world record. That one run single-handedly rewrote the entire sport's history. Bolden had a front-row seat to greatness from second place. Logically, the debate should have ended right there. The The scoreboard was final. The king had been crowned. High-stakes rivalries don't just stop at the tape, though Bolden wasn't about to just vanish into the shadows. He stayed loud, proud, and impossible to ignore, whether in the hot seat or behind the commentator's mic. He kept breaking down what it takes to be legendary and what true elite status looks like. He had the hardware to back it up: multiple Olympic medals and years at the top. To Johnson, however, there's a massive gap between being a contender and being the standard. That fundamental disagreement sparked a quiet, simmering friction. Bolden was exactly the kind of competitor that Johnson just couldn't vibe with. He was flashy and loved the spotlight's drama, while Johnson stayed stone cold and surgical. Johnson didn't argue often, but when he spoke, it felt like a gavel hitting the desk. Case closed. You won't find a massive blow-up or one specific grudge match between these two. Instead, it was a fundamental clash of styles. Bolden was still hunting for immortality. Johnson felt he already owned it. That ego colored his view of every sprinter who followed. See, Johnson didn't hand out respect for participation. Just being close didn't cut it for him. It was about total annihilation and leaving the field in the rearview mirror. Bolden was elite, but elite wasn't enough for the top spot. Enter the legend, Carl Lewis. Long before Johnson laced up his spikes, one man ruled the world. Carl Lewis was the blueprint for an entire generation. During the 1980s, he didn't just win, he conquered. 4 golds in Los Angeles were just the beginning of his reign. To the fans, he was the ultimate personification of Olympic glory, effortless, poised, and always the master of his domain. But control is a matter of perspective. When Johnson finally hit the big time in the early 1990s, track and field was already bleeding. That SEAL disaster with Ben Johnson had scorched the entire earth. All of a sudden, talent didn't matter if people didn't believe you were clean. Trust was at an all-time low. Lewis was still the icon, but the air around him turned toxic as rumors of a massive cover-up began to leak. Whispers grew that big names, Lewis included, had failed tests that were quietly swept under the rug by officials. The facts were messy, and the public never really got a straight answer on what went down. For the new crop of stars, the bridge had already been burned. The myth of a level playing field was dead. Michael Johnson used that cynicism to forge his own ironclad persona. He didn't inherit a prestigious legacy. He stepped into a mess that needed a total overhaul, and he made sure everyone knew he was different. A perfectly curated brand and a razor-sharp message. Obsessed with grit and being untouchable, he wasn't just trying to beat the guy in the next lane. He was distancing himself from a shady past full of holes, and Carl Lewis was the poster boy for that old world. They weren't exactly bumping shoulders on the backstretch, since their prime years never really collided, but Lewis remained the ghost of a tarnished era Johnson wanted to bury. That's where the friction lived. Johnson was too smart to start a public shouting match. He kept his cool, but every time he preached about integrity, it felt like a calculated jab at the old guard. No screaming, no drama. Just a cold, hard line in the sand. To Johnson, the gold didn't matter if people questioned how you got it. Reputation was everything, while Lewis was the people's hero. Johnson transformed into something else. Absolute, undeniable proof of perfection. He offered a legacy with 0 question marks. That rift never healed, and no photo finish could ever fix it. No knockout punch ended this, just 2 titans built on opposite ground. One era was tainted, the other was a desperate sprint for clarity. For Johnson, that single line in the sand meant everything. His real enemy wasn't the man who won. It was the ghost of everything he hated. Michael Johnson never needed to shout. He forged his legend in the silence. Pure control, absolute precision. He believed the method defined the win. To fans, he was bulletproof, a flawless king, yet that kind of clarity is never born from comfort. It is forged in friction. Every rival was a wall he had to scale. The doubt, the hype, and the clashing definitions of glory. Some carried scandals, others were just loud, playing a game he didn't respect. Instead of joining them, Johnson chose the harder, lonely path. He isolated himself. That distance was his identity. He never hunted for applause. He rejected their script. He authored his own destiny. Grit over flash, consistency over highlights, poise as the ultimate prize. But that level of focus always carries a heavy price tag. When you draw a line that deep, you define your enemies forever. Eventually, that boundary hardens, invisible to fans, but always present. This story was never actually about a single man. It was about a code. The cold belief that not all greatness is equal. We will always remember the gold around his neck, the shattered records, and that terrifying ease. But that is only half the story. History worships the win, but ignores the scars left to get there.